but monitor channels.
Waiting for YouTube to say it's alive. There.
Good to go, John?
We're ready.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this Memorial Presents Icelandic Banking Sector Collapse versus Muskrat Falls, Governance and Policy in a Time of Crisis. My name is Rob Greenwood. I'm Associate VP Public Engagement and External Relations at Memorial and Director of the Harris Center. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands from where you are located this morning and to consider the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. I'm really excited about today's session. We often with the Harris Center talk about the blind man and the elephant. Depending on your experience with the Harris Center, you think that's what the Harris Center is. And for many folks, they're quite aware of our connection with the international networks and North Atlantic networks around islands, but some of you may not be. So we have long-standing deep connections with island scholars and policymakers and community participants from around the world through groups such as RETI, which is an organization of island-based universities, the International Small Island Study Association, which in fact we're hosting their conference virtually through the Amira Innovation Exchange this June. And we have hosted the North Atlantic Forum several times, which came out of the North Atlantic Islands program. We've partnered with the Institute of Island Studies at UPEI over the years, and they were in fact the founders of the North Atlantic Islands program. And this project is a result of our ongoing involvement with those organizations. And Dr. Jim Randall is the principal investigator of a study that this project is part of. The Sustainable Island Futures Project is an ambitious comparative study of 6 pairs of islands from around the world. 1 island in each pair is a subnational jurisdiction, and 1 is a nation state. Newfoundland and Labrador, as we have done often, is paired with Iceland, and we all find that comparison compelling in many ways. Other than that initial pairing of the two and some high-level work that Jim is leading from PEI across all the islands, we were able to decide what did we want to focus on in particular around governance for this study. And we decided that given the magnitude of Iceland's banking collapse in the 2000s, or banking crisis in any case, in the 2000s, and the financial repercussions of the Muskrat Falls project for Newfoundland and Labrador, it seemed appropriate to compare the responses to those crises in each jurisdiction. What is it about our governance systems in Newfoundland, Labrador, and Iceland, and our political cultures that led to these crises, and how we handled them? And I think there's a lot we can learn for each jurisdiction by looking at these independently, but then especially in the comparative work. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce the team we put together for this project, and they really know their stuff in this field. Professor Mark Stoddard has worked at Sociology Department at Memorial since 2010. His research and teaching covers environmental sociology, political sociology, social movements, and communication and culture, with interest in oil and energy, climate change, and tourism development. He recently co-authored Industrial Development and Ecotourisms: Can Oil Extraction and Nature Conservation Coexist? Big topics that we're all looking at these days. Dr. Cole Atlin served as a postdoctoral scholar at Memorial University during this period. She specialized in research in the sociological impacts of industrial development in Northern Canada. and was the primary author of the report that she and Mark collaborated on. And Dr. Stilda Ylva Björnhertzdotter holds a PhD in political science and a Candidata Economics in Business Administration. She is an independent scholar at Reykjavik Academy, Iceland, and lecturer in crisis management at the University of Iceland. She has led an Icelandic research group on crisis management and has developed, along with Icelandic scholars, general guidelines on long-term responses to disaster for local authorities. So it's a superb team we have on this topic here today. Jim Feehan also played an advisory role with Mark and Cole, and thanks to Jim for all his work on the project. We've carved out an hour or so for today's session, and we'd like to keep it as conversational and interactive as possible. We'll start off with a few rounds of questions for the panelists, but then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. You can submit a question anytime as we get going now through the Q&A. And Boyan first, who himself is an expert on island economies. Boyan, for his master's, compared Fogo and Change Islands with the islands in Croatia. And so Boyan has been a key part of the Harris Center team on islands for many years. He'll keep track of the questions, and he will then pose them to the team once you post them to the site. John Duff will be helping throughout the process. So thank you, John, as always, with your great work through the Umira Innovation Exchange. I think that's all the housekeeping items. We'll get going now. And I think Cole is going to take the lead on the initial questions for her and Mark. And Cole, could you give us a 5-minute Muskrat Falls primer? That's a tall order. And in particular, we know where we are, or we think we know where we are with Muskrat Falls now. The really key question for this in governance and political culture is, how do we get here? What happened to all the governance instruments that were supposed to prevent something like this happening in the way that it did?
That's an excellent question, Rob. And I've been pondering it for a number of months. And I still think that the answer is this complex web of interrelated governance decisions that sort of cascaded down and made things compiling more and more challenging to get out of. But I think the simple answer is that the governance mechanisms that are supposed to protect public institutions, the province, the ratepayers, people like that, they were hamstrung. And the question kind of becomes, why, if these institutions, the public institutions that are supposed to exist to protect us from projects that are not good, that are not beneficial, not sustainable, not economically desirable, hamstrung. So I think, and in this project, we've had a clear direction from the research and from talking to others and from media analysis, that this sort of starts from Churchill Falls, starts from sort of this dream that happened when Churchill Falls emerged as this really powerful energy generating concept, but also sort of grew in the mythology of the province, and particularly with the unjust relationship with Hydro-Quebec and Churchill Falls. We sort of have this implicit bias that Muskrat Falls was going to be this do-over. It was going to be the ability for the province to access the resources that they were denied initially. So from that point, a lot of decisions, you can kind of see how they were made, how this bias towards the project going forward allowed for safeguards that would normally protect a bad project from going through, from being dismantled. So, and there's multi-scales. So we can talk about the federal impact assessment, which is sort of my area of personal expertise, where you had a strong, solid impact assessment, but the foundation of what they were allowed to look at, the foundation of how far they could look, if they could create independent data, if they could form their own sort of terms of reference, all of those things were sort of denied them, as well as transparent, full information. You can look at what happened with the pub, and it's being excluded from being able to review the project. You can look all the way down to the civil service, right? And look at the, there's work that Kelly Bluduk did for the Harris Center, looking at, the inability for civil servants to really speak truth to power for fear of recrimination. So all of these sort of compiled on the basis that it was presumed that this was a good project, and all of this was not, all of this was red tape, right? So we have this governance quandary where you have red tape on one side that you want to get through to get something forward, particularly in the economic boom when the project was proposed during the sort of the oil boom. And you have the need to safeguard and have projects make sure that they're good. And as opposed to measuring twice and cutting once, we sort of measured a few years ago and then hoped for the best. So that's sort of how I would put it in a little nutshell. I don't know if Mark, if there's anything else you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think the only things I would add, I mean, we've talked about that the work of the Public Utilities Board and the environmental assessment were quite good within their narrowed scope, right? So one of the issues was that both of those bodies had their assessment processes kind of narrowed in scope. But the work that was done still raised really important early red flags. And one of the things we know from governance literature, risk governance literature, is that governance failures often evolve because people ignore the early red flags, the early warnings. And I think that pushing through past kind of ignoring those early red flags that were raised in assessment processes was also related to these kind of background factors, like the kind of culture of the political culture of optimism during the oil boom years, the invocation of that kind of deep story about the Upper Churchill and Quebec and Ottawa and so on, and kind of getting kind of say treating the Muskrat Falls project as kind of a bit of a comeuppance or a balancing of the scales. And I think the other thing that Cole maybe didn't touch on, which I think is really important, there's also this like long-standing dynamic within the province of treating Labrador as a resource hinterland, right? So I think there wasn't really a lot of the kind of sober second thought about the project until people really did raise a ruckus and really draw attention to it, because that's how the center of political and economic power in the province in St. John's has treated Labrador for decades, right? So it's that isn't necessarily new. In that sense, Muskrat Falls might be the newest episode of an ongoing kind of metropolis hinterland kind of relationship within our province.
Thanks, Mark and Cole. I think that's an admirable synopsis in a short spell, but we'll unpack it some more as we go along. Stilder, we are less familiar with the Icelandic banking crisis. Heard bits about it through the media, but of course you're there and have studied it. Could you walk us through a brief history?
Yes. Iceland has been referred to as the biggest casualty of the global financial crisis in 2008. But compared to other countries, it has also been or managed to recover quickly. So the reconstruction process has certainly proved to be much speedier than most expected. So briefly, the burst of the bubble expressed in the collapse of the Lehman Brothers and the turbulences on the global financial markets that hit the country in 2008. It made it apparent that the Icelandic banks were not as stable as hoped for. Their assets and securities turned out to be weak. And then, of course, a demanding question, the first question was when the crisis hit was, so how could this happen? How could this have happened? So, of course, we had to look in the building up to the crisis, that the Icelandic society had been through liberalization and privatization of the Icelandic financial sector, massive expansion of the banks, as in foreign loans and bonds that the Icelandic bank issued and received securities on a very broad scale on the international financial market. And just to give an idea, between year 2003 and 2007, the total foreign debt went from 75% to 476% of GDP. So experts, they mostly agreed on the risks and vulnerabilities of Icelandic banks. And they stressed that even though things were going well at that moment, there were a need to impose more restrictions in order to address these vulnerabilities. On the other hand, some experts, and mostly working for the Icelandic bank, central bank, or the financial authority or supervisory authority, claimed that Iceland was well prepared and stable. So before the crisis, the financial supervisory authorities and the central bank were largely passive. They did not address the problems practically, despite knowing the risks of the Icelandic banking sector. Thus, the Icelandic banks were supposed to be monitored by the financial supervisory authority and regulated by the central bank, but they failed to properly fill the functions. So government's officials, particularly the prime minister, showed similar behavior as the central bank and the financial authorities in many ways, which is then of course understandable because they advise the government and on monetary policies. So the government did not frame the situation as a crisis for a long time. Instead, stated that there were no acute threat. So I think so this is the building up to the crisis. So it gives you, I hope, some idea. Thank you.
Great. So that's kind of, for both situations, the lead up in brief synopsis. We'll have more unpacking as we go. So Mark and maybe Cole lead off. How would you describe the governance response to Muskrat Falls? So once we got into it and we knew what was going on, what is it about the governance systems we have and the political culture that inform the response?
It's interesting with this because I think we're still seeing it's still early stages of response. So I think we can only really capture initial ideas on this. But firstly, the inquiry is the biggest example of a response, a governance response. There is a history of using inquiries as governance responses in the province. In Marlin's book, having trouble with the title at this moment, there's a chapter on it actually, which is very interesting. And you could update just to include the Muskrat Falls inquiry. But it was once again one of those situations in the province where you had a few individuals and also a community, indigenous communities who had traditional relationships with the Churchill River, who pushed any governance response at all, right? I mean, that's the reality. And this is mirrored across Canada, where you have indigenous communities who have utilized their traditional rights to say, this project doesn't help us ensure the future that we want. And these are the things that we would like to have happen. And what's interesting is, again, you can kind of see in the response to those, to the requests by the river keepers and others, that it was, comparatively, they were lost, right? The example of clearing the reservoir, for example, an administrative error, and that request was lost into the ether. So I think we're still seeing it. I think we're still seeing how this is going to go forward. But the governance responses have, in my opinion, haven't really shifted culture very much. If anything, though, at a federal level, interestingly, on the impact assessment front, the legislation, so the requirements would be much higher for a new project going forward, especially since things like Gull Island and other projects are still on the sort of the agenda of some individuals in the province. So I think it's a really good example of we're still seeing the implications. The COVID's also slowed down what might be some changes to how governance structures are going to work in the province post Muskrat Falls. But again, it also has increased the vulnerability because it's expanded the debt burden of the province. It makes it much more vulnerable to poor decision making. Anything else, Mark, that you think?
Yeah, maybe jump in and add a couple of things as well. So I think, like I said previously, like a common governance failure relates to failure to heed early warning signs. So the PUB and the environmental impact assessment both raised concerns with information transparency from Nalcor and the flow of information. So that was one of the factors that kind of fed into the crisis. But once it became apparent, another really common cause of governance failures is the failure to kind of pause when new information comes through, to take the time to process and reevaluate a project or risk when a new information comes through. And to a large extent, Muskrat Falls kept being, even after the crisis became apparent, the dominant discourse of kind of sunk costs, that we're too far along to really turn back or put a meaningful stop to the project, seemed to just kind of keep the forward momentum going, or the sense of inevitability going, even as costs were ballooning. Concerns were raised about slope stability, about downstream methyl mercury, et cetera, by people protesting the project. So even as these concerns started mounting, that discourse of kind of too far along to turn back really worked against the kind of good governance that risk governance folks write about. Also, I would just maybe draw on like Sylvia Walby a bit, the British sociologist who writes about crisis, and she talks about there being pathways out of crisis, including on one hand complete system collapse, a return to equilibrium, system renewal, and system transformation, so really revolutionary change. I'd say without having yet really seen what the impact of the inquiry is going to be, I think so far we've really approached Muskrat Falls in a return to equilibrium sense. It's like, just how do we muddle through enough to get back to normal, right? I haven't yet seen us thinking about using the inquiry to think about system renewal, right? How do we strengthen governance accountability and transparency, financial accountability and transparency for parent corporations, et cetera, that really should be the lessons we're taking out of this disaster or this crisis, in my mind.
Mark,
go ahead, Cole.
I was just going to say, one of the things that was really interesting throughout the project that you saw was a request for increased transparency of information from Nalcor, and a request for what I would say is sort of alternatives. That's how we frame them. What are the alternatives to the project? How do we go forward and still have sufficient power for NL to get off coal power and all of those things? What alternatives exist? And the limited alternatives analysis, that's one of the things that impact assessment does. That's one of the things that the pub can do. And so in terms of, have we seen a huge movement towards looking at instituting more alternatives analysis? No, as Mark said, it's going sort of back to that equilibrium stage, where if in the future, that's some place that might be a really good place to build on. How is alternatives implemented in all decision-making in the province to make sure that this is the best future possible? It puts more work on the front end, but it can really reduce problems and make sure that you're getting the most economic, ecologically positive, socioecologically positive result. And just your comment brought that to my to my brain, Mark. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Cole and Mark. So, Astilder, what was Iceland's response to the crisis there, and what led to that response?
Well, the first response of the government was rather hesitant and not transparent at all. And when the Glitney Bank that reports on liquidity problems and requests state financing or on the 25th of September 2008, the government comes to the realization that the financial situation of the bank had become extremely critical, and that action needed to be taken. And after measuring different responses, a public announcement of the decision to nationalize the bank was given, or that is say 4 days later. So it is then official to the Icelandic and the international public that Iceland has been hit by the crisis. So the Icelandic banks are not able to solve their own problems alone. Though the key message was that nationalization would ensure the stability of the bank. But despite that, the announcement, the Icelandic krona just declined even further. So it was reflecting the growing distrust of markets for the Icelandic financial system. So at this point, then our prime minister, he has this the challenging task to frame the crisis and communicate with the public. So he framed it as a part of a broader international storm, referring to the unfolding global financial crisis. But the public disagreed and framed it as a more of a local crisis, or an expression of an underlying systemic crisis of legitimacy or in the political system. Well, and then with claims of corruption and elitist behavior. But in our case, in this financial crisis, the public anger was an effective force for provoking a crisis of political legitimacy and subsequent reflexivity about governance failures and the need for reforms. So what happens, and this is not common in Icelandic society, that public start protesting, and it emerges immediately in October with a first rally drawing approximately like 1,000 people. The initial protest followed closely from the prime minister, from a prime minister television address, and the subsequent in January 20th protest outside the parliament involved 2,000 people with demands for the resignation of the prime minister. So, but protesters were also objected to the use of terrorist legislation by the UK against Iceland to enable the freezing of bank assets. So collective action included frequent large political rallies, even weekly, at the national legislatures, where there was a loud banging of kitchenwares, and earned the movement the name the Pots and Pans Revolution. So, and it escalated through January 2009. So what the protest is mostly focusing on is this, or primarily on government and political leadership. So as we know, that responding to these demands for accountability and learning is important in recovery from the crisis. And what you can say in Iceland that was important, that there was an investigation commission appointed by the Althing, or the parliament. It was a very important step in the learning process, and the commission delivered an 8-volume report that covered the antecedents and the causes of the collapse and related events. So, but there was also this demand for prosecution and punishment, and this is also something new in our culture, to punish the guilty individuals as a part of the reconciliation process, and shows also how angry Icelanders were. And Iceland actually became the only country impacted by the 2008 local or global financial crisis to bring those responsible to criminal prosecution and punishment. And finally, what also was kind of standing in maybe part of what led to the crisis, and also what was difficult in the learning process and the response, that it became clear that the communication and the collaboration within the government was not working well, which increased or created increasing pressure and contributed to the poor decision making. So the communication was a major problem among decision makers, but also between decision makers and external audiences, including the Icelandic media and the public, as well as international governments and experts. So inadequate information management, including a lack of media strategy, was a key shortcoming in managing the crisis. And this sense that the public had that information and truth were withheld from them amplified the public resentment, so protest and crisis of legitimacy for the government. So
Thank you. Very thorough, and it helps highlight the differences from Newfoundland and Labrador. And so, as we look at, many people highlight how Iceland is a sovereign country, very distinct from a subnational jurisdiction like Newfoundland and Labrador. But I remember in comparative research, it's often a way to understand your own place by looking at another place. Ottar Brox, the famous Norwegian anthropologist, always said he never understood the Norwegian fishery until he came to Newfoundland. And so when we look at these fiscal crises or different types of crises in Newfoundland versus Iceland, Mark and Cole, why the difference in responses? What do you pick from that comparison?
I think Mark can talk a little bit more about this, but the primarily we've thought a lot about the cultural differences between Iceland and Newfoundland and Labrador, and particularly the discussion about anti-reflexivity. So
what do you mean by that?
So Mark, do you have the 5-second definition that you the
Yeah, I think by anti-reflexivity, kind of the strategies, the discourses, the political tactics that discourage critical reflexive thought. So I think it's a concept that kind of comes largely out of things like climate studies of climate skepticism, but I think we can apply it here as well of the various kind of things that were at play in the sanctioning of the project, the approval of the project, continuing on as it started to become more apparent that we were heading into a crisis over the project. Those kind of strategies that kept critique from really slowing things down or stopping things. But yeah, so Cole, do you want to continue from that brief definition?
Sure. So it's challenging to sort of say exactly why Newfoundland is less reflexive on decision making than in Iceland, but it's clearly present in decision making, and it's often you saw where the reflexivity that emerged in this crisis emerged was by the Indigenous community and the leadership of a few economists and policy analysts in the community, and they faced significant political pushback. Right, there was a limited public engagement with those concepts. Often they were pushed to the side, saying, as Mark mentioned, this is sort of a hinterland issue, or these people don't have an understanding of the full complexity of what we're trying to achieve economically, or whatever it is. So by the time you actually had full public engagement on it, the discussion from the province was generally that we've gone too far and we really can't turn around, which is the same discussion that has happened in other major mega dams as well. Site C is a perfect example in British Columbia of the same discourse. So to say that there's a few cultural considerations of why, but it might also just be historically, and Newfoundland and Labrador has had, really trying economic conditions and have kind of become used to that. The cod collapse, the collapse of the fishery, other issues that have happened, and that these things happen, and that's life, and you sort of have to keep moving on. And if you question what the the province is doing or what the decision making is going forward, it can be considered less patriotic. This concept of patriotic correctness comes up. So it's something that's sort of a new emerging discussion point that emerged out of this comparative research with Iceland. Anything else, Mark, that you want to flag?
Yeah, for me, the clearest thing that came out, and maybe because I'm partly a social movements scholar, political sociologist, is really the difference in public anger. That to me is very, I think in the Icelandic case, public anger and mobilization was much more widespread than we've ever seen here around Muskrat Falls, and actually did serve to push the economic crisis into being a crisis of political legitimacy for the government, right? That really started to shine a light on issues of a kind of democratic deficit that were tied up with the economic crisis. Certainly, as Cole said, there were dissenting voices right along who questioned Muskrat Falls, but they were largely kind of contained or marginalized to a large degree, even though most of their critical projections have been proven right. They've mostly been proven right with the passage of time. The folks like the Uncle Gnarly blog, etc. Those have been proven prescient with the passage of time, right? The other thing here is a lot of the opposition to Muskrat Falls came from Indigenous community members and allies in Labrador, and there I think that's where this island center hinterland dynamic played out in part, in the way that protest was maybe never exploded to the same extent or depth that it did in Iceland, but also the idea that the policing and criminalization of protest in Labrador, the legal costs that came from that would also maybe have had a chilling effect, perhaps, and it's one idea we might play with there as well. But between these different things that happened, we never really saw public anger reach the kind of scale or depth that it did in Iceland. And I think that's a large part of the difference in how we can understand the different responses, where we're kind of looking at more of a return to equilibrium pathway out of crisis. Whereas I think when we look at the Icelandic case, it's shown more signs of system renewal, of crisis recovery that have built in stronger measures for transparency and accountability going forward, economically and politically. And I think, in that comparison, I think, one thing that became apparent to Cole and I think were the way that things like FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, or UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada is kind of a signatory to, that they haven't really become central to our political culture here provincially, right? They don't really have the kind of teeth that would have allowed the kind of Indigenous-led protest around Muskrat Falls to really create as much friction in the project as maybe somewhere else in Canada. And I think that's just another big part of the difference here. And so certainly one of our main kind of recommendations or findings in our report is the need to really strengthen respect for UNDRIP and FPIC principles amongst within our political sphere provincially, certainly. But yeah, I think public anger is my 2-word short summary of all of that, of why I think things went so much differently. This public anger and the scale and scope of it in Iceland versus here.
Thanks, Mark and Cole. Stilder, you mentioned the anger and the direct response by Icelandic citizens wasn't that common based on the past. So what's your sense of the difference with Newfoundland and Labrador, and maybe the difference within Iceland within its own context? Or
yeah, I think actually it would be of interest to dig deeper into the cultural roots of it. And but of course, maybe people over there may be more peaceful than we are. But well, we have been like an egalitarian society through the 20th century, and of course had several disasters. And usually in the responses and in the blaming, people have looked at institutions or look at the markets, etc. They have not focused on individuals. So I think that is so interesting that with this privatization, and Iceland was becoming very much market driven, and which is a more like a individualistic emphasis. And the individualistic emphasis is much more, when playing the blame game is focusing on individuals. Who is to blame? Who did wrong? Etc. So at the same time, like people here in Iceland, there was so much push to go back to our old values, to our egalitarian values. But at the same time, people were demanding this like a individualistic punishment. So that is also what I'm especially also looking at, is this interplay between culture and crisis management, and you can see really the push and pull, and it's still going on, of course, in society. So I would say that really the culture, and this is just a kind of a proposition that actually going through these huge changes in society and with this market economy kind of made us more aggressive. And it's just a question if we had bounced back. But I agree that we haven't totally done that. But yeah.
Thanks, Stilder. Boyan, I'm going to come to you very quickly for questions from our audience. And so, folks, if you have questions in there, great. If you want to add some, please do. And Boyan will go through and put them to the panel. Mark and Cole, very quickly, because we want to get to the audience. Any key takeaway, the key lesson from all this, as you can see, going forward?
I think that for me, and I always go for, I'm not trying to be a depressing end to your question period, Rob, but that it could happen again, and that it likely would happen again, unless you had a really, and I think that people have a desire for this not to happen again. So hopefully that, public engagement and critical analysis could prevent something like this from happening again, but the vulnerability is greater. So we're, 50% of the province's debt burden, I believe, is just as a result of Muskrat Falls. That's a stat that's in the report. And I think that, the province is in a much more vulnerable place. So they have to be much more careful with how they make economic development decisions. And I don't think that putting all eggs in one basket necessarily will result in everything that the province may hope for. Mark, anything else?
Yeah, I guess I would say that I think the aftermath, the still unfolding crisis, or the aftermath of the inquiry, gives what's perhaps a once in a generation opportunity for some social learning, for actually some system renewal in terms of transparency and accountability, in terms of governance and mega projects. And so I guess my concern is that we won't seize that that pathway out of crisis as a chance for system renewal, as a chance to increase transparency and accountability, but instead that we do just kind of muddle back into this kind of equilibrium where we don't really integrate into our political structures the lessons we could learn from this. I think the other lesson I would take from this is we, given that, think about that there were early red flags, right, from the Public Utility Board, from the environmental assessment, and so on, that were largely ignored. So I think, what we need to be thinking about is strengthening these processes and the ability of them to have to gain traction and have real impact. So we should be deeply skeptical when people want to weaken these processes. I know we've seen that over the last year or so, particularly the oil and gas sector wanting to weaken some of the the kind of exploratory assessment kind of stuff. But I think we want to be deeply skeptical of moves to weaken assessments and overviews that are there to try and ensure accountability and transparency for mega projects, for economic risk and environmental risk. And I think that for me, that's one of the big, things out of this as well. Absolutely. One of the key lessons is whenever anybody tells you we want to weaken our assessment and overview processes, be very suspicious.
Thanks, Mark and Cole. Istildur, any quick thoughts before we go to the audience on where to for Iceland now based on all this?
Well, where to now? Well, this experience has actually, fortunately, resulted in tighter government control over economic and market forces, and then a constitutional reform process that was also launched, which is a highly participatory process, and in this recovery process, which is of course has been longer than in Newfoundland, that the Icelandic central bank has steadily been able to build up our foreign currency reserves. So the state finances have become much healthier, which has allowed the government, for instance, today to respond firmly to the COVID-19 economic situation. So, but finally, however, the economic recovery may not make us overlook that we are still dealing with public distrust and anger. So, because people got hurt, they lost their families, they lost their homes, etc. So, for instance, today is the agenda of the government to sell the Iceland Bank, which is the former Glitnir Bank. But this public is very skeptical and afraid of history is repeating itself. So people are still arguing that we are dealing with nepotism, lack of transparency, etc. So that we still need to tackle corruption and unjust. Thus, when it comes to the social issues, we actually have not yet achieved the final healing in the aftermath of the financial crisis.
Thank you, Istildur. Bojan, what's the first question from our audience you want to pose to the panel?
We have a lot of questions. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to bunch a couple of them together, and maybe we start with our guest from Iceland. So here are a couple of questions. Mike Clare asked, why did the banking regulator not exercise its power? Were the public servants afraid to lose their jobs, or did they simply not understand the scale of the problem? And connected to that is, once the government decided to nationalize the banks, did the bankers benefit from that?
Yeah.
Thanks, Bojan and Mike. Istildur.
Okay. Should I answer now?
Yes, please.
Okay. The latter question, that surely the bankers, this was, so they were gaining a lot from this, and there was a lot of corruption, and of course the reason they went to prison was that they're not holding ethical practices. So they did that, and it's a very difficult. I often get this question, and I remember when this was actually kind of just when the crisis hit, people were asking, so how come, how can this happen, and where did all this money come from, etc., etc. And we, Icelanders are of course ashamed of this, but it was kind of like a, as we call it, like a euphoria, and everything was going so great, and this kind of overestimation of the financial sector. As you can see in that, Iceland was supposed to become this international financial hub. It was it was kind of this euphoria, and everyone played along. Of course, there were these who were skeptic and were criticizing, but they were just looked at as being negative and jealous and etc.
That sounds very familiar, Istildur. Irrational exuberance. Bojan, another question.
Sure. Let's go to Newfoundland now. Tom Cooper asks, one of the big drivers for Muskrat Falls was the skilled trades unions, who were very influential in promoting good paying jobs for their members. Icelandic banking may have had specific finance industry stakeholders groups that had more influence than others. When we compare and contrast Icelandic banking and Muskrat Falls, how do we identify and explore the role of special interest groups to mitigate risk for future projects?
Thank you, Tom. Great question. Mark or Cole, want to go in first on that one?
It's a very good question, and one that we didn't spend a tremendous amount of time looking at. For my own practice, because I'm an environmental consultant, special interest groups have a significant role to play behind the curtain of decision making, and it's very hard for that also to be transparent and public. So it is a question that I think warrants more analysis, for sure. And one advantage, I'll just talk about the federal impact assessment legislation that would say if Gull Island went forward and how that would change an impact assessment on that, is that you would have to put out in the decision statement on whether or not a decision should go forward, the justification as to why. The government would have to do that. And so, in those statements, you would think that they would highlight likely economic factors, and you could probably trace back more readily the impacts of special interest groups. But Mark and Istildur, do you have any additional comments about that?
Mark, do you want to go first, or?
Don't really have anything to add to that at this point. If you want to go, yeah.
No, I just say that in Iceland, this is always a challenge, the role of interest groups, and in general in small states, and of course small island states, that this connection between the government and or individuals in society are so close. So interest groups are extremely strong here, and especially in the fishery sector, and that has been, but yeah. But that's yeah.
And do you think, Istildur, they played a role in the way the government acted or didn't act on the crisis?
Yeah, well, they did definitely. Well, if you can talk about it, maybe not interest groups, but in a way, those bankers, that they formed their own group, right? Mm. And they kind of were involved. They were in in the political parties, etc. So they had all kinds of threads that they were able to pull in their advances. So
personal connections played a role.
Yeah, more personal. But I would say, but in the maybe in the response to the public, then we had, of course, this, and today we have more. Maybe it's one of the consequences that, for instance, we are experiencing a rise in the strength of labor unions in Iceland that have been kind of dormant for some decades. So, in a way, we can trace that to the financial crisis. So,
Mark and Cole, did you see evidence of the personal connections part that Istildur mentioned in Iceland?
We did. Quite heavily. And I mean, that's sort of an inevitability, right? You have a major project going forward, and you want to hear more about why it's a good thing as opposed to why it's a bad. That's human nature. But that's a very common issue. And that it was interesting. Certain people that we talked to who were against the project felt they really didn't have the capacity to some people didn't have the capacity to speak out, particularly as negative things were happened to people who did speak out often, in terms socially. So there was definitely a social element to social ostracization or marginalization that we really did find in this decision making, and this also relates back to sort of Danny Williams, and there's an old boys club that was a discussion point as well, heavily, that there were many interest groups that were supporting each other in this project, helped many of those interest groups. So that was definitely a major point of discussion in the research. But again, it's very hard to delineate in the research how much that influenced a project versus something else.
Mark, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just that theme of kind of a lot of informal communication. That comes up repeatedly. That we have that what's been called like a very personalistic political culture. So I think a lot of when you look at some of the governance failings, certainly that informal nature of kind of backstage communication works against often transparency and accountability, right? And so I think it's partly by nature of being a kind of a smaller polity, is that, and communication styles tend to be more informal. But I think, as we've also seen from other work done on Muskrat Falls, the political culture under the Williams government, there wasn't a lot of space for critical thought or open expression of criticisms. So, that's basically that further cements that kind of informality of communication, right? When you don't feel like you can put in writing, this is why these are the problems, right? For example. So I think that one reason why that actually structuring in processes to increase accountability and transparency is so important, even if it's not the ultimate solution to everything. There will still be problems, but it's one way to increase the ability to trace what went wrong and responsibility and so on. Interestingly, one of the really big differences between the Icelandic case and Newfoundland and Labrador is that Iceland was, I think, as far as I know, the only country coming out of the 2008 global financial crisis that actually sought criminal responsibility from the people that were seen as being responsible. Whereas in the Muskrat Falls inquiry, that's been specifically set outside the scope of what the inquiry's tasked to do or to talk about. So I think that's also, when we see this kind of interest groups, informality, personalistic political cultures, and so on. So that also just kind of comes to mind when we think about some of these issues as well. That that if we structure in stronger measures for transparency and accountability, we can maybe work against some of those tendencies in a small polity towards informality, and how that can pave the road towards poor decision making sometimes.
Thanks, Mark. Boyan, another question.
Well, I have a perfect segue question to what just Mark said. Dave asked, have any prosecutions of miscreants in the Icelandic crisis reached the courts?
So that would be for Estelder. Yes.
Excuse me, can you repeat it?
Have any persecutions reached the courts as a result of the inquiry into the banking crisis?
Yeah. I think there were like 30 bankers that had to go to jail.
So not just to court, but to jail.
To jail, yes.
And Rob, it's interesting to parallel that. I have not been as up to date on what's happening, but I do know that the only at the stage of the report was drafted, the only individuals that had faced any criminal consequences were Indigenous community members, Labrador land protectors in our case, in the Muskrat Falls case. So, you compare that, it's a really interesting comparison of concepts of justice, right?
Thanks, Cole. Boyan, another question.
Sure, lots here. Also, folks, there is an interesting discussion going on in the chat. So keep it going, but I'm going to focus for now on the Q&A panel. And if we have time, I'll pull something out of the chat, but don't let me stop you chatting over there. Okay. Dave, please compare the relative scale of the two problems, Muskrat Falls versus the Icelandic Icelandic banking crisis, for example, relative to the GDP?
Yeah. So I imagine Cole and or Mark have off the top of their head the scale of Muskrat Falls within the Newfoundland Labrador GDP per capita debt. Where would you place that? Do you guys have a number handy?
I don't. Do you, Mark? I mean, I know it's 50% of the province's current debt burden, at least as of October. So, and given the province's debt burden, we can probably clear.
That's a pretty telling.
Yeah.
That's probably good, Cole.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm sure it's in the report. I don't have it front of mind. Also, if Jim Fian happens to be in the audience, he could probably shoot that into the chat pretty quick and easily. I'm not sure if he's with us today.
And
So.
we do have the report, folks, that the initial report on Newfoundland and Labrador is on the Harris Center website now. Stilder, in terms of scale, magnitude, how big a hit was the Icelandic crisis?
Is it an answer to say it was huge? But I think the collapse or our debt at the beginning was like ninefold of our GDP, ninefold.
Right.
So we were really in risk of being just going to bankruptcy. Which was the yes.
And
Just
folks,
risks in here, correct, in the province. So sort of, I think that in terms of scale, they're probably quite similar in terms of the risk of bankruptcy provincially and as a polity, as a state polity. So.
Yep. And folks, there will be, in addition to the report on Newfoundland and Labrador that Cole and Mark have done with input from Jim Fian, there will be a comparative report that will be available very soon also. Boyan, next question.
Okay, let me see. Let's go to Steve. To what extent is the Muskrat fiasco a result of an adversarial political system that provides no space for substantive policy debate? The most prominent center of opposition was the Telegram and the people it chose to publish, especially around Penny and David Vardy. Questions they raised were never answered.
So Mark and Cole, the adversarial political system part of the problem here, and then we'll see how that would relate to Iceland.
I think likely. I think that's probably, it's part and parcel of this package, this full suite of problems that all combine to create this problem. As Dave Vardy and all the folks that, the gnarly blog and all of those points that were raised were really marginalized throughout this process. So as Mark has said, governance systems that don't acknowledge red flags put themselves in a position where things can go quite wrong. And the system was not in a place where you had a lot of ability for, I would say, public participation. So yes, I think that did definitely play a major role. Mark?
Yeah, and I just add, I think it's telling of the two major parties that have formed a government since the project was conceptualized and into sanctioning and seeing it through, the Liberals and the Conservatives. What we've really seen is just kind of a rebranding of the rationale for proceeding with the project. And we've seen that a few times without ever really stopping to engage in kind of meaningful reflexivity about those red flags. And so under the Conservatives, it was kind of this, kind of almost like provincial kind of nation building project to kind of get, kind of balance the scales with Quebec for the Upper Churchill. And then under the Liberals, it was kind of pivoted to like the too far along to pull back, right? We were too committed to really take a meaningful pause and step back. And then I think even more recently, it's kind of been rebranded a third time to maybe a lesser extent as part of the provincial climate action plan, saying, well, this is part of our decarbonization plan to shift to greener energy and to kind of therefore kind of offset Holyrood and all that stuff. So, we've I think because of partly that adversarial system there, we've seen this kind of rebranding of it without ever really doing the good governance things that would have been to, stop and assess the early warning flags, to reevaluate the project in light of new information that was coming out, and so on, and to not just kind of let it get pushed through. Yeah.
This happens in a lot of provinces though with major projects, right? I mean, clearly in projects where they're very far from, as we've said, that hinterland concept where you have generally Indigenous populations with limited political power, and so this is a pattern throughout Canada, and worldwide that we can trace in many ways. So there is also these concepts of structural power that are also really at play in discussions as well in the adversarial system.
Stilder, my understanding of Iceland is that it's much like the other Nordic countries. And in fact, like most countries around the world, Canada is more like Britain with the first past the post electoral system. You have more proportional representation. My sense is you have a lot of different political parties with different ideologies, but they tend to form more coalitions. Is that fair? What's your take on adversarial politics as part of this?
Yeah, certainly coalition. But there's also a development here that we are seeing a huge increase in political parties, and political parties are becoming more and more like one-issue parties, and which is kind of making it difficult to focus on ideology. So yeah, that's. But it definitely, our politics is more like a consensus politics. That's.
Do you think that had a part in the Icelandic response, or the lead up to the crisis and then the response, or was there any? Have you seen any connection there?
You mean about the consensus, or?
Yeah, is the consensus politics a strength or a weakness leading to a crisis like that?
I think in a way it can, it is just like the group dynamics, so this consensus, I would say maybe it's a point you're making, that because there were kind of this, what you call it, this groupthink, you can say that.
Right.
In government, but because there's people forgot themselves in the party.
Very interesting. Boyan, another question.
I have a quick one from Dave for Astildur, and then I have a comment from Mike, a comment from Ted Howe, and a question from Ted that comes out of that comment. So let me ask Dave's question first and then get back to me, okay?
Okay.
So did the government of Iceland guarantee payment to bank depositors? Did they have to pay out? If not, how did they avoid payment?
Well, what they did was actually, because they were not actually capable of, or they had this inability of the banking system that caused that Iceland dumped a mountain of private debt on foreign creditors. So, but then, so that was not something that they couldn't help kind of doing, but then they made this helpful decision in the responses, that they made agreements with creditors to pay stability contribution, and then at the same time they could avoid some that what you call like a 30% exit tax. So that's what they did. So yeah, but what they did with the emergency legislation, that they ensured the private accounts of Icelanders. So, and that was also really the request of the public, that they said those who have actually taken part in this craziness, they should pay for it, not the general public.
Thanks, Stilder. And we are getting close to running out of time. I know this is a topic we could go on for days. We probably will need to have another Memorial Presents down the road on maybe the governance implications of all this. Boyan, one last set of observations or questions,
Sure.
and that'll be the basis for the panel to make their final comments.
Okay. Mike Clare says, I think it wasn't so much a question of sunk costs, but more one of a poison pill. Nowcor committed the province to the extent that it could not pull out of the project because debt instruments had already been entered into. So just a comment. Ted Howe has a comment and a question. Mark mentioned an optimism bias in the early days of the project. Early Nowcor presentations showed sharply increasing energy demand and oil prices, not only in the context of increased costs of operating Holyrood, although a natural hedge existed, but no sensitivity analysis on capital costs. That bias was also present throughout the business community and trade unions because of local business opportunities. Other than the few dissenting voices, no one wanted to do a full analysis of alternative solutions to the future energy requirements or risk analysis on the project. Question following my comments. Do the panelists believe that the optimism bias existing at the Nowcor board as well? Did this cover their fiduciary responsibilities, especially with respect to risk management?
Thanks, Boyan. And Cole and Mark on that one?
I would say yes as a short answer. Now the Nowcor board, there's a lot of questions about how adept the appointments were on, like how the knowledge base, a lot of questioning about whether or not the Nowcor board was stacked with people that didn't have any experience on the projects that they were undertaking. So do I think that the people that were appointed to the board in short would have had a bias towards the project going forward? Absolutely. I mean, it's their business, but also I do think that they didn't have much knowledge of a hydro mega project as well for comparative analysis. So yes, how's that?
Mark, anything to add? And to clue up your remarks for the session.
Sure. Yeah. I'd agree with Colin. It's not hard to read. So I think we don't have a lot of firsthand data from board members. So I don't want to actually, I guess, infer what their own personal views or beliefs might have been. But I think it's certainly, we can see this kind of pattern of optimism bias. I was reading a paper the other day on Site C, kind of a recent publication that also talks about how Site C and its kind of disastrous unfoldings in British Columbia, like that the optimism bias was a huge part of that story. Could have been reading, I think, very much a pretty much the same paper about Muskrat Falls. But I would say, like, to maybe temper that a bit, though, that issues of transparency of information between Nowcor and the province were raised repeatedly, including by the Public Utilities Board, by the Environmental Assessment. So that's that information flow from one agent from Nowcor to the government were a consistent issue. So I mean, I guess I would say that there probably was an optimism bias at play, but maybe not to the degree that people were being openly transparent with information that might have maybe changed some of the decision making earlier on. Maybe the last thing I'll just mention, I saw some of the comments scrolling by a little bit, and maybe two other minor points if I have a minute. Rob? Yeah.
Sure.
I noticed somebody just mentioning that large scale hydro not being green. I'd say I didn't mean to imply that. I'd say that's how the government is kind of discursively framing it. But I think that's often a disingenuous move that doesn't pay attention to landscape footprint impacts and downstream impacts. So just to really clarify that that's not my own view, despite the way that that's being framed in provincial climate policy kind of stuff these days. And then the second thing I caught running through the chat that I thought was interesting was about protest being kind of a weapon that's available to the weak, to the disempowered. And I don't want to say that public anger isn't important or protest isn't important at all. I actually think they're profoundly important in this case in provoking reflexivity But one of the problems with public anger is that it's, by its nature, it's reactive, right? It comes after the mistakes are made, after the crisis is apparent. And so by bringing in some of these, by learning the lessons and actually engaging in structural system renewal around transparency and accountability, at least at the very least, we can protest different things. Maybe we have to protest less often. Maybe the mistakes that are being made are less egregious, but I don't think, I think I'm a big believer in the power of protest to have political efficacy, but it is always limited by being more reactive, being a more after the negative effects are apparent. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's kind of more of a both and in that situation. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. So Stilder, this comment was about the optimism bias. And you mentioned in your earlier comments, the euphoria that was in the air during that period of Icelandic economic prosperity, just as Newfoundland and Labrador had when oil prices were high and big projects were advancing. And of course, some economists have described it as, I forget the term, but that euphoria, irrational exuberance, that's the term.
Yeah.
Newfoundland and Labrador, I think, maybe in the opposite spin now, although we're grateful COVID has been managed as well as it has here. What's your take on Iceland and that euphoria now? Are you a more somber people? Are you a more pessimistic people? Or are you optimistic but critical? What do you think of that?
Well, I would definitely say we are more somber. I would hope so, but at the same time, optimistic. We have also been so lucky, in the recovery process. So it's not only the government making, but we have disasters helping us out, like in the Eyjafjallajökull glacier eruption, and now we have another eruption. So it is going to help us out of the COVID-19. So that's so. So I would say, I'm kind of not being sarcastic, but in a way, the Icelanders are always optimistic. Something will come up and help us out of it. So, but at the same time, we really have not only those skeptical, but we also have, which is the downside of this, we also have a very negative critic, like in social media, etc., which is maybe the reality all around the world. So it's more difficult for governmental officials actually to serve the people, I would think, due to how they are much attacked. Yeah.
Well, all very ponderous questions for the ongoing governance of our jurisdictions. And these are stories that are not finished clearly. And we will be looking forward to the comparative reports that you all are working on and will be out soon. The report by Cole and Mark with the input by Jim Feehan is on the Harris Center website now. And I really want to thank the panel for a fantastic job. Really great discussion and some really, I think, telling insights, and no doubt lots more questions to ask. We did record today's session. If anyone would like to rewatch it or share it online, you can find it on the Harris Center's YouTube channel. As I say, a report by Mark and Cole is on our site now, and we will have a comparative paper available soon. Our next session by the Harris Center is part of the Forecast NL series on the impact of climate change on our economy and society. It's scheduled for May 6th. That session will focus on the impacts of climate change in Labrador. You can find more information about that session and all of our projects on the Harris Center website. Thanks again to our panelists for a superb job today. And thanks to the Harris Center team, as always, for pulling the session together. Thanks to John Duff and Conference Events and Services at the Emera Innovation Exchange for all your great help with an online session. We look forward to going in-house before long, or maybe hybrid. And thanks to all of you joining us today and viewing the recorded session. Clearly, we're all still wrestling with these governance issues and decisions to come, but we really hope this critical analysis and comparative work will help inform that going forward. Can't thank you all for participating enough, and we'll see you at the next session. Thanks a million, and all the best.